I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
On today's episode, I'm joined by Govini's Tara Murphy-Doherty and Jeb Dobiner to discuss the defense industrial base, America's critical supply chain weaknesses, and of course, how the defense tech moment can be met both within the world of policy and, of course, the world of startup, tech, and venture capital. In this conversation, we also cover the opportunities and challenges facing both the DoD and the private sector when it comes to these issues, and how we can move forward while handling new technologies such as artificial intelligence and challenges at a geopolitical level.
15 years ago, one would hear senior DoD officials, 3- and 4-star civilians saying, why is it that in the rest of my life, I've got the cloud, I've got an iPhone, my kids have an Xbox, but we don't see it in the defense space. Where are the tech companies? And then we went through the whole thing that it turns out some tech workers may not be in favor of working for defense. It turns out, when we look at the vantage point of 2024, lots of the top technical talent in America wants to work with the U.S. military.
People in DoD have yet to really understand what AI can do for them. Jeb early on gave the example around visibility 50 tiers into your supply chain. At that point, you're looking all the way down at the raw material. That's only possible not just because of the data you can make available, but really what you're doing with the data. And that's just one small example and just the beginning of it.
Hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining us on the show. Tara Murphy-Doherty and Dr. Jeb Dobiner, welcome to the Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having us.
Really excited to chat with the two of you. So, Tara, let's throw this to you first. Let's kick things off by just introducing your background in defense policy and how your work relates specifically to the theme of this podcast, rebuilding the arsenal of democracy.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Govini. And Govini is a defense software company that specifically is delivering software products that are purpose-built for the defense acquisition process. I'll come back to that and connect it to the industrial base in a second. But I've spent my whole career in the intersection of defense and technology. As you mentioned, the first, I won't say how long actually on a podcast, but the first period of my career, so I'm not dating myself, was spent at CSIS and then in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon. From there, I jumped ship to the private sector, but have been focused on national security still, first at Palantir, and I've been at Govini now for 6 years.
Great. How about you, Jeb?
I've been working on some aspect of defense industrial base and technology competition for almost 20 years. Been a Lockheed Martin Vice President of Engineering and Technology, and I've worked also the public policy roles and several tours in the Office of Secretary of Defense.
And one role I'd like to discuss with you for a second, Tara. So can you discuss your work on the Reagan Institute's National Security Innovation-Based Program? That's interesting to me because I like when you have CEO founder types in this space be deeply intersected into the policy problem set, as opposed to kind of memorizing a couple of lines about attritable systems and coming into things. So I'd love for you to highlight your expertise and focus there.
Yeah, Marshall, I completely agree. I actually think that it's really important in the defense industry to be able to speak multiple languages and to be able to connect the solution that we have, which is an AI-enabled technology solution, to the issues that defense leaders work on every day, which are policy ones, their strategy ones, and then, of course, across the military, operational challenges as well. So the Reagan Institute created the National Security Innovation-Based Program a couple of years ago, and I am absolutely delighted and honored to serve on their advisory board. This program was started because of an observation that the Institute had that the makeup and character of companies participating in the national security industrial base and the defense industrial base was really changing. And yet a lot of the systems and structures in defense and national security weren't keeping up or making commensurate changes. And there was a gap essentially in the policy sphere for the study of and facilitating discourse around and ultimately recommending policy prescriptions and approaches that would better facilitate the insertion of innovation into what has become a pretty brittle industrial base.
And Jeb, you are a listener of this podcast. As you know, one of my favorite sections is focusing on specific problems that we need to address. We were chatting before this program got together, and we've sort of teed up two of them. I'd like you to start with one problem that I think relates both to your work at Govini and then obviously your DoD work, America's most alarming economic dependency. So I'd love for you to kind of introduce that problem set. We'll get into solutions a little later, but let's just level set with things we can all agree on, aka there's some problems we need to confront right now.
Sure, Marshall. There was a time in America where we made everything. Yeah, we did imports. We've been doing that for a long time. But if you were a defense contractor making an airplane, like literally down the street, there'll be just about every component you could ever need being made a stone's throw away. Well, that changed over time. And right now, one of the most shocking things that gets relatively little attention is the degree of low-end but highly important Chinese components that are in our military systems. And it's not as if the prime contractors are buying those Chinese parts, but they're imported into the U.S. Remember, these supply chains, some of those are 50 levels, and they're entering that system. They're not necessarily labeled. And here's the rub is. If there's an interruption of trade with China, whatever reason, to whatever degree, it just means those parts are not going to be available on production lines. It means those lines are going to slow down and stop.
So I think the immediate question then that I'd love to throw to you, Tara, is given that problem set, to what degree is that a policy problem versus a problem that, let's say, a procurer at the DoD could get excited about a new tech company coming down the line? Talk about the kind of mix of both that problem probably presents.
Absolutely. Well, there are certainly policy aspects of the supply chain, both fragility as well as foreign presence in it, especially for critical defense matter that Jeb is referring to. We've seen some progress since COVID in this area from a policy perspective. The Office of the Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment has put out some excellent initial work sort of evaluating the state of affairs and providing a framework for supply chain risk management moving forward. What we also saw, especially in 2021 and early 2022, was a huge proliferation of pilots across DoD, where different offices were saying enough already with simply talking about supply chain challenges. COVID blew our supply chains wide open. And if we're going to get our arms around both the foreign challenge as well as the lack of availability of material and parts, we're going to start doing things differently. The natural course of action is typically that these pilots run for a year or two, and then people decide to centralize some of the approaches, standardize the methodologies, and to some extent, and depending on the problem, invest in capabilities to get after the problem based on what they learned in all the pilot experiences. It sounds pretty reasonable, right, as an approach. What we haven't seen is the Department of Defense move out in a meaningful way on any sort of centralized or standardized approaches. And so what you have are pockets of excellence across the department. Now, there's a policy side of that, to answer your question, where either OSD or at the service level, the acquisition offices could issue acquisition policy saying programs or even procurement officials who are swiping government credit cards, there is an expectation and a responsibility to do some sort of vetting of the purchaser and the supply chains behind what you're either building or buying. That is still spotty. The other side is a technology. answer, which is to say you can demonstrate to the policy community if you are that procurement official who's empowered to buy on behalf of the United States government, or if you're a program manager who runs a major defense program, to simply demonstrate the results you can garner by putting especially AI-enabled, commercial data-driven products against this challenge. Now, supply chain is just one small part of what Govini's flagship product, ARC, does, but it's a really good example of how we can drive change that can both influence policymakers, but also doesn't rely on policy in order to get after those better mission outcomes.
And one quick follow-up for you. So let's say we lived in the perfect world that I'm sure is on a slide deck somewhere, if y'all are raising for any matters. 10 years out, we have this vision. ARC is capable of identifying all the different layers of the supply chain. There's definitely, though, a gap between understanding these opaque supply chains and actually implementing the changes necessary relative to the way that Jeb articulated the challenge. So how do you then think through that gap from a policymaking perspective? So you can entirely crush it as a CEO, yet we'd still be confronted with this problem if we can't actually do anything about the vulnerability.
Right. So, well, let me do a better job of introducing Govini for your listeners who aren't familiar with the company. So I mentioned we're a defense technology company, and we have this flagship software product, ARC. And what it really is it is a set of applications that are purpose-built for different phases of the defense acquisition process. And this will come back to your policy question, I promise. So if you take a big animal picture kind of view of defense acquisition, it begins with science and technology, conceiving of the next generation of capabilities that our warfighter needs. We move past prototype and into production. From there, you go into sustainment, which is the longest part of a typical defense program's life cycle, and then into modernization. And that's an increasing trend as these long-lived programs don't need to be completely decommissioned, but actually can be modernized with technology insertion. And all of that is underpinned by supply chain, where the specific supply chain challenges and questions change depending on where you are in that acquisition lifecycle. So if I were to fast forward 10 years and think about how do we leverage that kind of technology to get to ultimately a better future, what we need from the policy community is we need a sane approach, and we need a willingness to take action in order to create more space for venture capital backed, vibrant technology businesses like our own. And we're not the only ones. As you've seen, the increase in new entrants into this space has been remarkable over the past decade. But the system hasn't kept up, and the policy community could do a lot in order to open the doors and create, like I said, space for these new companies. Ultimately, that not only has a positive impact on things like defense supply chains, but it's going to add vibrancy to the defense industrial base in a way that is actually going to have a really meaningful impact on U.S. national security.
You know, Jeb, something. Please, yeah.
There are things we could do with our defense industrial base starting today. I could probably give you 7 of those. Tara and I have written about a number of those. But right now, we've got the defense industrial base we've got. But are we making really the best use of it? And I would argue in some ways that we're not. The only way to make better use of it is through data and let the machine begin to identify your options. So, for example, we talk about single source suppliers. The defense industrial base is rife with those, where there used to be 15 or 75 suppliers 25 years ago. Now there may be 1. Okay. Well, if you're utilizing software in a way that other industries do, like financial services, for example, well, you can identify maybe there's a second supplier that's in Italy. Okay, now you have 2 suppliers, and maybe you can identify a supplier that's in Taiwan. So now you have 3 suppliers. And if it turns out that the Air Force and Navy are tapping the same single source supplier, you can identify that today with the machine. Or, for example, our platform, the ARC. And then you can have a conversation between the Air Force and the Navy and say, okay, how are we going to prioritize this? Are we going to qualify a new supplier? What's the schedule of it? Instead of it all just sort of crashing and being a pickup game. And those are things that we can do right now.
Speaking of things we could do right now, I'm glad you brought up that supplier vulnerability point. I'm curious, almost from a economic planning perspective, which, speaking from a center-right think tank isn't, particularly traditional here, but I think it really matters in this category. Is there a world where, as a matter of policy, we just decided through appropriations and just the fact that these are government-run programs to say, hey, we're actually going to decide that we want 3 or 5 different suppliers of these critical parts of the defense industrial base, even if it's not purely economically efficient. It just seems like at a baseline level, maybe we don't need 15 different suppliers. It's not the, 1980s Cold War anymore, but it'd be great to have more than one. What do you think about the ability of government to just basically arbitrarily make those sort of decisions, Jeb?
Well, I think that we consolidated, and that was a government push, and we're supposed to get a lot of savings. The result was we got very little competition. We got increased costs. So, if one is empirical, whether one is, right or left, just based on, sort of empiricist viewpoint, you got to say that doesn't really work. Generally, having some competition does work. You're able to recompete things. So, personally, I think that we would be better off bringing in more suppliers. This is one of the amazing things about the defense tech space that's opened up. 15 years ago, one would hear senior DoD officials, 3- and 4-star civilians saying, why is it that in the rest of my life, I've got the cloud, I've got an iPhone, my kids have an Xbox, all these things, but we don't see it in the defense space. Where are the tech companies? And then we went through the whole thing that turns out some tech workers may not be in favor of working for defense. It turns out, when we look at the vantage point of 2024, lots of the top technical talent in America wants to work with the U.S. military. So it does exist there. So, for example, on Chinese parts, we can make substitute parts. We may be able to do so cheaper. We may be able to use information technology to buy up lots of Chinese supplies and stockpile them, just like they do with us. Those are things that we can do right now. But part of it involves the Defense Department. The Defense Department has every authority that it could really ever need in acquisitions, but part of it is exercising those authorities and really bringing in the new players for competition and for new products.
Tara, something I'm curious about. You definitely showed off your policy chops by very articulately and clearly delineating what the past 2 years have looked like from an acquisitions reform perspective. But something I'm really curious about is it felt a little at a policy level, low energy, pilots, experimentation, the gap between, I think, the articulation that most people share across the aisle of the problem and the ways the past few people have gone, I think feels a bit low energy. And something a Hudson colleague of mine, Dr. Nadia Shadlow, has been really pushing lately is the idea that we needed to bring more urgency into this space. And I think as a CEO of obviously not only a private sector, but a tech company where, in many ways, VCs, LPs, et cetera, would expect high energy responses to problem sets. Can you talk about how we can maybe have a bit of a mentality shift in DC and really import that attitude in a way that isn't just a cliche about in the private sector, everything's great? Because I just usually, I will know part of the reason why I like speaking with tech founders and CEOs so much on this show is that there's just clearly a gap in, I think, mental models and expectations from a leadership perspective. So can you speak to that?
Happily. And I love that question, Marshall, because I absolutely agree. We need to, if I could just do a massive injection, perform a massive injection of urgency into the DC arena, it would be very exciting. And I will say it's one of the reasons that I love working in the private sector. I've dedicated my career to defense, as you asked about at the beginning. And yet I prefer to serve it from the technology sector for exactly that reason. And it's not because people aren't working hard in this space. I mean, the hours we put in at the Pentagon were at every bit no, they aren't as long as I put in now, but they are long. People work hard. And the impact you can have in those jobs is phenomenal. I mean, I was a staffer in OSD and a lead negotiator for the United States at the 2011 Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva. Negotiating with the United Nations as a 20-something-year-old is an unbelievable career experience. And it's the kind of thing that makes people passionate about wanting to perform public service. But it is so hard to move quickly. And so I think the heart of your question is, how do you, if you can marry up these very fast moving, energetic businesses that want to work in defense and national security, if you can marry it up with the mission, how do you marry up the cultures to some extent to include the speed? And I think it really comes down to creativity. Because I think my point about with the vignette around the Pentagon is that the commitment is there and people's grit and willingness to put in the time and effort and hours are there. So how do you break through the bureaucracy to move at speed? And in the technology businesses, we talk about things like bias toward action. And in government, you talk about not getting in trouble or not stepping outside your own lane. And that kind of culture shift has to come from leadership. Maybe I'm biased in, my seat as a CEO, but I think everything starts with the leader who sets the right tone and demonstrates through their own actions what they expect of the team in terms of how quickly they're going to move. Also, a really important part of that is when you bias toward action and you're moving fast, things are going to break. And so the question in my mind isn't how do you move fast enough, but slow down enough so nothing breaks. You don't. You move fast, things break. You teach your people to break the right things. And that is really all about assessing risk, understanding the core of your business or your mission if you're in government, and leadership.
That's great. Yeah, please.
Mark, I think one of the problems is we're not allowing a lot of the best people in DoD to really become the leaders they could become. And this is an issue of tenure. So let's go right to the heart of the armaments acquisition process. The typical program executive officer and program manager is in the job 1 to 3 years. Okay, let's compare that, let's say, with Hyman Rickover. He was in the job for decades. Or Grace Hopper, who invented naval computing, decades. Or Brute Krulak, who brought us the Higgins boat. Or Bernard Shriver. He had 3 different jobs between the late 50s and early 60s, but they all were working on the Minuteman. So you basically had 10 years of continuity. What does 10 years give you? If you're good, if you're bad at 10 years is a disaster.
To be clear.
Right? That's the job of the Secretary of Defense, to remove such people. But if you're good, it really takes almost 3 years to master the job, to know where all the bodies are buried. It takes 3 to 5 years, 6 years to develop the confidence with the Congress. The Congress is the one that appropriates. Congress right now has very little confidence in the DoD. There's a lot of things they'd like to do. So if we had longer tenure, like we put in first-class people into places like Futures Command, and then after at most 3.5 years, they're out of the job. And that is not the way to reward talent. We can do things differently.
I think something I'm curious about then, what from your perspective explains the culture shift from 40s, 50s, 60s, this area you're referring to today from that 3-year expectation? Because once again, and this is where my questions to you, Tara, about the nature of tech versus government. In no startup or serious hard tech environment would you expect program managers to really get this together in 1 to 3 years. So I'm curious, Jeb, what do you see as the root cause of this shift at a structural level?
Jeb, before you answer, can I just react to one thing, Marshall? I absolutely would expect somebody to be able to perform the job in 1 to 3 years. And that's a really good example of the difference, which is you take a job, a leadership job, an executive position or a vice president position in a technology company. And the expectation is not that you're onboarding and you're ramping. The expectation is that you're productive and that the onus is on you as the individual to get yourself up to speed and do what it takes to get there so that there is as little to no ramp time as period. I very much agree with Jeb on the tenure question, but I would take a little bit of issue with the idea that it's because you need this amount of time to get into a position of fully executing. I think it's because you come in ready to execute from day one, and in order to deliver maximum impact and get the value out of the product or capability that you're trying to field, you have to have a longer view than just 12 to 18, maximum 24 months, because the incentives are very warped when your view, your horizon only extends out such a short period of time.
Yeah, and I just want to, Jeb, before I throw it back to you, I want to modify my point because I totally agree with your pushback. Because what I was really kind of getting at is, at a core level, from a CEO perspective, I think that because you're in a market-oriented space and you have investors and there are customers, everything is set up in a way so that has to be the response of like 1 to 3 years. I think what must be frustrating, and this probably comes down to like a talent question of like, are you going to go work at a high flying startup or at a VC firm, or are you going to work at DoD to solve these problems? I think a lot of folks' experience doesn't really sync with what you described in terms of the opportunities that are prevalent in the sort of private sector. So I think that's sort of a relevant sort of addendum, but I really take your comment well. But Jeb, throwing it back to you, take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, I think one is the let's say you take a really talented officer becomes a PEO for a program. So they enter into this sticky mud. Okay. What we've been substituting regulations for leadership. We've been doing this now for almost 40 years. I'll just tell you a little story. This goes to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. So he's Secretary of Defense 75 to 76. He comes back to the Pentagon in 2001. And then at some point in 2002, he's just really frustrated. He finds he's always being told that he can't do X, Y, or Z. And he says, I'm a 70-year-old man, but I do recollect having done that in the past, and it was legal. So then his general counsel came in and brought in Title 10 from 1976, and then brought in Title 10 from like around 2001. And it was multiple more volumes. So that's some of the things that people deal with. And it takes a lot to begin to get out of, get the stickiness off you and begin to get moving. And I think a number of these things do take time. I'm not saying that, action should start day one, but we're simply moving people out too quickly, I think, in the theory that we want to create an all-around all-purpose general officer. And the reality is, Hyman Rickover, he was really not a very good seaman. He wasn't a general. He was not a general 360 sort of leader. But it turns out that he mastered nuclear physics really well and how to build reactors.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the, rounded versus pointy spear debate here. And I think that given the stakes of the moment, I think we have to take a slightly different approach to the way we thought about things in the 90s. So for this last section here, we've covered the defense industrial base. We've covered the economic dependencies. I want to just close, Tara, by speaking with you a little bit about AI, and obviously Jeb will bring you in as well too. I was just at the recent Hill in the Valley event that was put on in DC a few weeks ago, and I met a more than decently prominent startup founder in the AI space. And he basically said, look, I don't focus and cover these defense industrial base issues, but it seems to me that AI should represent a solve for a lot of these problems. And my kind of general answer right now is not at all clear that's true. If we're looking at what the Chinese are pulling off when it comes to their shipbuilding, the scale of their arsenal of autocracy, as people are trying to make that sort of phrase happen. If you're looking at what the Russians are pulling off vis-a-vis Ukraine right now, it's not as if they're powered by ChatGPT 7 and churning things out. So can you, just as a CEO who's also engaged in the policy space here to articulate what you think AI can provide from a game-changing perspective relative to sometimes there are just hard problems in the real world, and there's a weird mix of mission focus and policy and frankly just economic change that needs to happen? How would you unpack those?
Well, I think you're exactly right that it is the applications of AI, especially the really revolutionary ones, they're not necessarily obvious across our world today. I have a great friend who is a former Army, and he describes the war between Russia and Ukraine as a really good exemplar of just how not modern war is. We see tanks, we see old artillery from decades ago being used. We see what seems to us in the field like what we had considered the old way of fighting. And it turns out, well, even when you've got a relatively great power like Russia involved, that's still the way that war is playing out. That being said, you referred to some of the advancements from a military and technology perspective that China is working on. And so it's not that more modern capabilities aren't coming. And certainly the United States has its own arsenal that spans everything from, the material and weaponry from the 50s and 60s to what I think are some of the best, most cutting edge systems in the world. But is it obvious yet? Do we see the impact? I would say no, not as well as we could. And secondarily, that a large reason for that, I believe, is because people in DoD have yet to really understand what AI can do for them. I think we as Americans are just wrapping our heads around what AI can do for us as individuals, whether it's in our day-to-day lives or various aspects of, a variety of different professions across different industries. In national security, defense, and the federal government, it's hard for people to see how AI can be used and used appropriately given all of the strictures on the way they do their jobs. But from a sheer technology perspective, is AI changing the world? Absolutely 100%. And this is really just the beginning. The massive launch of generative AI through large language models that we saw starting in November 2022 and just continuing since is so game changing, not just because of the advancements we saw in the models themselves, but the fact that they're self-learning models. And so the development of AI is increasing, but also the rate of change is driving up additionally. The way in which Govini's been using AI for a decade now is really around the use of data. And the fact that we can collect data at scale, we can process it and extract meaning from it. We can even create data through AI. All of those things are what come together to ultimately solve problems that haven't been solved before or haven't even been solvable. Jeb early on gave the example around visibility 50 tiers into your supply chain. At that point, you're looking all the way down at the raw material. That's only possible not just because of the data you can make available, but really what you're doing with the data. And that's just one small example and just the beginning of it. We just need to do a better job of getting the conversation to be about the problems that can be solved with AI instead of just the AI itself, which also has, last point, Marshall, I promise, has the downside impact in our field of sometimes scaring people. So when the emphasis is on the methodology, the AI side of it, I think a lot of people in the government space get nervous instead of talking about the problems that can be solved, in which case everyone can get behind it.
No, and this is your platform. And that was a great answer because you really, I think, got to the core of a frustration I often have when I speak with defense tech VCs, because there's this urge, both from a valuation to getting LPs excited perspective, to kind of discuss this quasi sci-fi version of what modern conflict looks like. But as you said, and your Army colleague pointed out, it's a mix, just as World War I was a mix. On the one hand, you do have the deployment of the tank for the first time, but it isn't until 1939, 1940 with, blitzkrieg tactics that like the tank is taken to its logical conclusion. And we don't see the tank truly transform warfare in that way. I think we should think about drones and AI and other tech in that context as well, too. There's very much this new world where we could see a vision of, but we still have to be very aware of the last things present. So, Jeb, last question to you before we let Tara take it out for us. As you pointed out, I'm glad you said this. It's not 2017. Everyone and their cousin is hopping into the defense tech space. I work at the University of Texas. We have a defense research advancement arm that's very much not like a 2010s, 2000s reality at university level. Did a first conference. There are no protests. This is just the world we live in now. Because everyone's joining, though, I think we're in danger of not just a hype cycle from valuation perspectives, but just sort of like too much conventional wisdom, not focusing on the problems relative to what's cool in the headlines. What is your advice for people who are entering into this space, either as LPs, VCs, or founders, given how this is now a cool space?
I think to focus on very concrete problems. So, for example, can I get American naval shipbuilding to operate like Japanese shipbuilding? Like the Japanese they make the same Aegis destroyer we do, and the shipyard can tell the Japanese Navy by the week or two that the ship will arrive. Okay, this is in the realm of the possible. This is done by artificial intelligence, using the supply chain. It's not scary artificial intelligence. Or another, like a concrete problem. For the Indo-Pacific, there's no munition that we need more than long-range cruise missiles. We do not make enough every year. I would love to see the government put out a tender and say, okay, this is the basic characteristics of a cruise missile that I need. Okay, and then let's see, it needs to go this fast, it needs this much electronic magnetic shielding, it needs to carry this kind of warhead, it needs to be this size to come out of such and such container. I think that these people that are in Texas and elsewhere, in El Segundo, and Massachusetts, I think we'd be surprised by the number of answers that we would come up with. And for the government to say, can you do it a third cheaper and a third quicker? And if you can produce at the end of 1 year, you get paid. If you don't get paid. That's the kind of entrepreneurship. That's the deal I think that the entrepreneur community needs to make with the DoD to get it out of its sort of, big acquisition process.
So Tara, to close us out, the two of you and the company specifically put a lot of like really interesting research, writing, thought leadership, et cetera. Can you just sort of direct folks to where they should go to learn more about not only Govini's work, but frankly, just like the thoughts that you all have, because it's been it's good to showcase a company where I don't feel like I'm doing kind of an ad. Like I'm genuinely interested in like your thoughts, and I really appreciate that. So just close us out for where folks should go to learn more.
Govini.com or arc.ai. And I'm very excited to say that one of the pieces that we're really known for is an annual national security scorecard. And we put it out every kind of early summer. And we publish this not because it's our core business as a software company, but because it's a great way to highlight the availability of data and the intelligence that it can provide you in the national security sector. The reason that I'm here at Govini is because I saw such a gap in the market in terms of curated data for the defense sector. And the fact that the alternatives, at least when I was in the Pentagon, and I would argue it's been true until the launch of the ARC, and now we're seeing other entrants in this space, the alternatives were a data call, which nobody answers, internal government databases, which for a long time, unless you owned that database, nobody had access to, or random Googling and searching. And guess what? You can't find a lot of information, thank God, on the open internet about U.S. national security activities, not at the level of detail that policymakers and practitioners across the Department of Defense need. And so one great way to not just promote your work, but also to educate your market and make them aware of what can be achieved because this data exists and we can make it applicable to your world, is to create the thought leadership pieces that actually speak to these people and to participate. It actually, Marshall, it brings us back to your very first question. By participating in the dialogue, we most importantly drive the mission forward, but it also allows us to engage in this space. And so look out for the upcoming scorecard. It's going to be great again this year.
Excellent. Tara and Jeb, thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.